So I would like to welcome you to a new edition of the TUCS Distinguished Lecture Series. It's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Heikki Topi. Heikki Topi is a professor of computer information systems at Bentley University in the US. He holds a PhD in management information systems from Indiana University Graduate School of Business. He has contributed to national computing curriculum development and evaluation efforts in various leadership roles, including being a member of the ACM Education Board, member of the Computing Sciences Accreditation Board of Directors. He has been a co-chair of the Information Systems 2010 Task Force and a member of the Information System 2002 Task Force. He has been a member of the Computing Curricula 2005 Task Force. His research focuses on human factors and usability in the context of enterprise systems, information search and data management, and the effects of time availability on human-computer interactions. He's a co-author of the Modern Database Management, a very popular textbook that has now gone to the 11th edition. And his co-edited volume 2 of Information Systems and Technology will be published in April 2014, meaning that maybe it has been published Monday. Yeah. Heikki Topi also held various administrative leadership positions. He has been an Associate Dean of Business for Graduate and Executive Programs at Bentley University, a chair of the CIS department at Bentley College, a director of the MSIT program at Bentley College, and an associate dean for the MBA program and director of the International Center at Helsinki School of Economics. Without further ado, I give the floor to Heikki.
Jon, thank you very much for this very friendly introduction. I barely remembered half of the things on the list, so nice to be reminded. But thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and I really, really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you for the invitation. For the next 45 minutes or so, we will, I hope, start a conversation on a topic that I believe is critically important for all of us in a number of ways. And one of my goals for today's talk is to convince all of you that indeed this topic matters for every single person in this room, not only from the perspective of your scientific academic interests, but also from the perspective of your interests as private citizens and members of society. The focus is on big data and big data analytics and decision making, but particularly from the perspective of the implications and consequences of specifically focusing on social, economic, and workforce consequences. So if you came here hoping to hear a talk about latest advances in algorithm development in this area, or the latest hardware technologies, I have to disappoint you. But I hope that I won't be disappointing you, because I believe that whatever your point of view is, whatever your specific interests are, I believe that this material and the points that I'm making are relevant and important, and I believe there is something new for everybody. I hope that after this lecture portion we can have a good conversation. I'm really looking forward to your feedback, your comments. Academic discourse at its best is a very interactive process, and I hope that that will be the case today. Thrilled to be in Turku, by the way, and I think the hospitality that I've experienced here has been tremendous. I had meetings yesterday from 10 a.m. until about 11 o'clock at night, and continued this morning. Tremendous welcome, and I really want to thank everybody for that. Okay, so let's get moving with this. We of course have to always, in the case of a widely hyped term such as big data, ask the question, so which is the one that we are talking about? The definitions vary, and not only the words, but the intent and the meaning varies tremendously depending on whom we are listening to. The definitions that are based on some kind of variation of 3 V's or 4 V's or 5 V's, those are pretty common. The words that describe that are exaggerating and that are describing phenomena that are hugely large and significant are quite common. Unprecedented, staggering, immense, and such, as you can see in these definitions, are quite common. Or if we move forward here and take a few others, the words that are often used are words that describe fundamental big change, processes and capabilities that are radically different from what we had. And of course we know that the change is significant, but maybe not quite as radical as the hype describes. But it is clear that we're talking about a phenomenon that has a significant impact, that has attracted interest from a variety of directions of society, and that offers tremendous opportunities and that requires our attention for a variety of reasons. I personally fully believe that the opportunities related to effective and meaningful use of data that comes in volumes, that come with variety, that come at velocity, that has value, that has the appropriate veracity. Those opportunities are very significant and they are worth paying a lot of attention to. However, what tends to happen in this discourse that when we look at this issue from the perspective of specifically data, and solely from the perspective of data, we tend to forget certain perspectives. And today, one of the key points is that there are perspectives that are easily ignored, and if they are ignored, that can be harmful for the purposes of the conversation and our understanding of the opportunities and our ability to benefit from them. We need to remember that the number of stakeholder groups and the potential stakeholder groups is significantly larger than the commercial enterprises or the government units that often are thought about in this context. And we'll talk about the fact how individual citizens and individual stakeholders, a number of units of people are highly affected by these phenomena. We will see how the scientific community is faced with questions that are quite different from those that have existed earlier. We will see how professions that we never thought would be affected by any conversation related to data are affected, and so on. Also, when we talk about big data, it is easy to forget that algorithms are, of course, equally important as data. Data alone would be pretty much useless. I don't have to tell that to you, but when we want to take a holistic view, we have to remember the algorithmic focus. And then finally, one of the very critical elements is that there are a lot of embedded ideological debates, questions about values, conflicts related to values that deserve our focus in this context. And so when we go forward, we will see that there are a lot of things coming together in a relatively short time frame in this context. So first of all, there's no question about the fact that just the sole volume of total data that is being collected, stored, and processed and utilized is expanding exponentially. It's just simply a fact. Technological development continues at a pace that we might be able to call unprecedented. That is also a fact. And the technological change is such that much of it takes place in secrecy. And so in secrecy of the protection, intellectual property protection of private companies, or then in secrecy because it's protected by national security interests, at least supposed national security interests of various government level actors. There's a heightened awareness among the general public and various public players on these issues. A couple of examples, one from the US, one from Finland. In the US, the White House announced last January that the president had requested a very rapid 90-day review of the impact of big data, particularly from the perspective of privacy and security, but also including other societal impact perspectives. In Finland, the Ministry of Transport and Communications set in January a task force working on the Finnish big data strategy from the perspective of use of big data, in many ways focusing on opportunities rather than any other dimension of this. At the same time, we are starting to see quite highly skeptical voices in the public discourse. For example, in the press, Financial Times published about a month ago a lengthy piece that was entitled "Big Data, Are We Making a Big Mistake?" This particular article was just as an example, had its own major weaknesses, but an example of the type of discourse that we are starting to see. So the conversation is well justified and actively going on. So one of my key theses in this presentation is that we have a need for a systematic and multidisciplinary analysis of the consequences and implications of big data. That's really the key point which I'm trying to illustrate from a number of perspectives. There are many reasons why these consequences have to be and should be analyzed and understood better. There are those that are very well known. Individual privacy and protection of individual privacy versus the benefits of big data is one of these dimensions that is well known, well recognized. But there are many others, and the others that are more hidden and not that well understood are a very important reason for this debate and this conversation to take place, and to take place in a context that allows a systematic analysis and that allows a structured way to look at that. And the academic context and academic community is an excellent place for that. And these include things such as the tremendous asymmetries of power that exist in this context, where in many cases big commercial players and large government agencies have capabilities that are not known. They are protected by the secrecy that I just discussed, and they're used in a way that is potentially disadvantageous for those whose data is being collected and used. It's also important for innovators in this context, the ones who are working on technical innovations and pushing the boundaries of technology, to be responsible for the consequences and at least think responsibly about the consequences of the results of their work. Not just simply blindly accepting the fact that the technology will be used as it will be used. It's not my responsibility to think about that if I'm just developing it. It is important that we provide tools for an analysis of the consequences even before the technology is moved forward. There are also important questions about the nature of knowledge and the nature of truth and what it means for something to be true in this context and given what is happening in this context. And finally, personally, I believe that one of the most critical elements for achieving the benefits of big data is the maintenance of an environment of trust. Because if an environment of mistrust is created and develops, it is quite possible that the public conversation will get to a point where there will be rushed regulatory actions, where there will be private and individual concerns at the level where individuals will start to take actions that prevent us from achieving the benefits of big data. So there are many reasons to perform a systematic, ongoing, structured, multidisciplinary review of the consequences and implications. And so what I'm talking about today is linked to and based on an event and a process that culminated in a workshop funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation that took place last January. Now, what is important to understand is that this is not about one workshop. The workshop was just an important part of this process. But this workshop was led by my Bentley colleague, Lynn Marcus, researcher in information systems, a leading scholar in our field, who has for a long time studied unintended consequences of a number of technology phenomena. And this fits her longer time research framework. And what this workshop did, it brought together researchers from a number of academic fields, highly qualified leading researchers in information systems, information science, economics, law, health sciences in various forms, and so on, who came together with the goal of forming a research agenda and understanding what the key elements of the research agenda are. At the same time, it was not only about the research agenda, because in order to form elements of the research agenda, and through that inform public discourse and funding decisions. It was important that this conversation also worked to enhance our joint and integrated understanding of what the consequences and implications of big data analytics and decision making are. And ultimately, there was a third important purpose, which was to encourage the U.S. National Science Foundation, but also other funding agencies ultimately around the world to make sure that in their interest and enthusiasm about funding technical research related to big data, that they would also allocate some resources to funding research on implications and consequences. Research that is based on solid conceptual and methodological foundations that brings together a variety of different players and research that is intended to inform and also have policy implications. And so that's what the project was all about. And so the next 15 or so minutes, I will look at two aspects, two dimensions of the results of the workshop and the workshop-related process, which included a number of position papers that the participants wrote and in-depth analysis of the position papers, the workshop conversations, follow-up work, and such. And those two dimensions are, first of all, something I'm calling categories of context. And we identified three categories of context for in which the big data implications and consequences are particularly important. And so I will review those. And then the second important set of discovery and emergent set of categorization are related to emerging pervasive themes, themes that were omnipresent in the conversation, and some of them are well known, others hidden, and something absolutely worth bringing more to the forefront. Quite quickly about the categories of context, the first one of which is something that is very familiar for at least most of us, science and science policy, because obviously big data offers a number of opportunities for us as scientists to explore phenomena that might not have been accessible for us earlier, and in ways that were not possible to do, using mechanisms that were not available earlier. There are great benefits in this context. Getting value through research that uses data that is available, that is being collected, but that is not used. And these contexts and examples are everywhere, where we see that existing information systems in a variety of contexts, whether it is healthcare, it is finance, it's law, it's scientific discoveries of various types, it's energy, and so on. Data that is being collected and either soon tossed out because there just is no current interest, or then is maintained somewhere but not done anything about. Great opportunities when the right questions are asked and the data is used in the right way. We also have discovered recently social media as an excellent opportunity to do all kinds of social science, behavioral science related research, and we are just learning how to do that right. Also, various types of funding agencies have become much better than they used to be in requiring researchers to share data, make it available, and also provide metadata in a ways that makes it possible to reuse data in other contexts. But these benefits are not without risks, and there are concerns that are created in this context. We actually have major questions about the impact on scientific principles, scientific values, and practices. Among them, foundational questions about methodology and understanding of what it means to know something. There are epistemological questions that are quite fundamental. The question about theory-driven research versus data-driven research. The idea that traditional proposition hypothesis development not being necessary anymore because we have these population level masses of data. What is the impact of this development on the nature of science and our understanding of what it means to know? Starting from questions that are as foundational as these, we have the ability to answer them and not just blindly move forward. There are all kinds of questions related to quality of science, for example, because of questions related to quality of data, and quality of data questions that are left unanswered because we are so enthusiastic about the new opportunities that are there. Protection of personally identifiable data, increasingly good ways to de-anonymize data that has been anonymized because of our analytical capabilities have increased. How to protect the privacy of individual subjects, fundamentally important issues. So this is the domain, this context of science and science policy. Then, of course, we have the context of our everyday life, and that's the context in which we should all see that these issues matter for us as individual citizens. No matter what our scientific interests, no matter what our political interests are. Yes, indeed, we can get great benefits that are offered, for example, by commercial providers that are collecting data and offering things such as Google's suggestions regarding your next search based on what you have done with your search history, or Amazon's recommendations regarding the next book or the next movie that you might want to consider. Things where you are giving up part of your personal privacy to gain advantage through these commercial providers. Some cases where you might even get direct compensation for releasing some part of your private data. And obviously increased connectivity. So why is Facebook doing what Facebook is doing? Ultimately, Facebook is doing that because the connectivity data is incredibly valuable from the commercial perspective. And that's why and how they are announcing now record profits quarter after quarter, because advertisers are discovering that connectivity data is incredibly valuable, but that connectivity clearly is a personal level benefit. Many of us are benefiting from it and using it to our benefit. Now, what's important here is that there are concerns that are beyond the security threats and privacy laws, which are the most obvious ones. There are questions related to, for example, inaccurate decisions, biased decisions based on poor quality of data, missed identifications, incorrect connections, the fact that data is always messy. There are questions related to lack of verification in this data and automated decision making based on non-verified data. There are questions related to the extreme level of first degree price discrimination that commercial entities are able to perform at much higher rate of accuracy, able to predict what an individual person is willing to pay for a particular good or service, and it's never the commercial entity that loses and that increased accuracy. And then finally, the third element of context that we identified based on this conversation that has taken place is this broad context of organizations and work. And many of the benefits that are widely discussed these days in popular press and in various trade books and such, they are in this space of benefits that organizations can get through increased productivity, new ways of doing work, discovering connections that they never knew about, monetization of data that they had been collecting for whatever reason, for some secondary purposes. This increased and highly granular segmentation of markets, again linked to this first degree price discrimination. So significant benefits, clearly so. At the same time, there are questions and concerns also from the organizational perspective, and many organizations don't really see these as concerns at this point, but others do. For example, changing power within organizations. Many big data initiatives are leading to increased level of centralization. Many of these efforts work only if there is a centralized approach to maintaining the sources of data and bringing them together. Also, changing nature of work and the impact on professional identities and the nature of professional work that will then ultimately have also an impact on the work itself and the organizations that perform that work. Okay, so we have these three contexts that we can identify. So let's keep those in mind: science and science policy, individual private citizens and everyday life, and then various types of organizations and work. Then the other dimension here are these pervasive themes. And we identified these 6 themes in this context that in this material are widely present throughout the material, but they also we have been able to see that the same categorization works quite well for analysis and interpretation of other types of qualitative data related to this context. And something that is very well known, again, are these questions related to privacy, and personal privacy particularly, and the threats against it. However, there's a perspective on this that I think is helpful to take and that offers something new. And that perspective is that there are this personal privacy has to always be seen. Then the loss of personal privacy typically is related in one way or another to collective benefits and then the benefits of special interests. And one has to look at it from the perspective of the balance, particularly when one looks at personal privacy versus collective benefits that genuinely are useful for a large group of people. there's tension, and that tension would need to be resolved. There are very significant questions regarding ownership and access of data. And that's the area, for example, where these questions of asymmetry of power are particularly important and difficult. Who owns the data, and how is one as an individual able to deal with these questions when the opposing interests are seemingly much stronger. Then the question of quality, and quality particularly because of reuse. The idea being that, first of all, some people appear to think that quality of data doesn't matter as much in this context because there is so much of it, and because there is so much of it, we can deal with the quality issues as noise. Well, that is not necessarily the case, and particularly dangerous are the situations where we take data from one context, move it to another context for reuse it without fully respecifying it. There are questions related to transparency and validation of big data, particularly because there is so much work related to this that takes place in secrecy. Behind the legal protections of intellectual property rights, or at least interpretations of intellectual property rights, and there are legal protections of secrecy, also because of the need to protect individual privacy. And these questions are questions that require a variety of types of expertise to address, as is the case actually in many of these, where we need to bring together ethics, we need to bring to the conversation legal issues, legal expertise. We need to look at it from the perspective of psychology, of trust, a number of perspectives that are critically important. And then there are these questions that emerge from this process that are related to the nature of work and the qualification requirements of work. The nature of work questions are particularly important from the perspective of the role of expertise, the changing expertise requirements, and the impact of the changing nature of expertise on professional organizations and professional identity. Such as, for example, when radiology work is being, at this point, not necessarily even automated yet, but structured so that it can be performed in small chunks and outsourced to be done at a rate of cost, at cost level that is significantly lower than that associated with within a highly paid expert in a specific context. And suddenly we are in a situation where at least major part of an expertise that used to take 12, 15 years to acquire is now being essentially, from the local systems perspective, outsourced and automated. Or what will happen in a another medical context question, what will happen to clinical expertise and its value when the clinical information systems or decision support systems that are based on tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of cases are essentially given the level of importance that exceeds the expertise of an individual physician in a certain diagnosis context. What is the impact of all of this on the profession itself, the way the work is done, and what the desirability of that professional context is? We know that big data benefiting from big data is only possible if individuals who work in this context actually have quite a demanding and demanding set of integrated capabilities that bring together analytical skills, communication skills, argumentative skills, negotiation skills, domain understanding in a way that doesn't exist often these days. So what are the requirements, what is the impact of this on educational system, evaluation of personal characteristics of people who will be working in this context, critically important questions that would need to be answered again in a systematic way by people who have expertise in the relevant scientific fields together. And there we need to bring together experts on education, experts on the specific domains, experts on information science, information systems, and so on. I have a lot of other material on these pervasive themes, but I will skip that now. I've talked about many of these elements, and because I want to use the remaining few minutes on bringing this together from the perspective of how do we move forward from this, what are the general lessons that we believe that we have found from here, and what is it that we are proposing and taking to the decision makers. So first of all, it can be shown that there is a set of consequences, both negative and positive, associated with the big data analytics and decision based on that analytics, where the positives are clearly there, but at the same time the negatives go far beyond the typically assumed privacy and security concerns, and some of them are fundamentally important foundational questions, such as the question about the nature of knowledge, what it means to know in a valid way. What is it? What does it mean from the perspective of our organizational structures and ability to perform effectively certain types of tasks that are required for us as a community of human beings when expertise changes its nature and partially is hidden, at least partially is hidden, and in practice performed by roles that are deeply embedded in systems developed by these invisible technical workers, a term that has showed up in this context quite often. And what is the impact of potential lack of trust in these systems when they are as omnipresent as they are? So, what does this mean from the perspective of impact and desired outcomes on research? So one element that is critically important here is the fact that, first of all, we need to make the case for integrated research that crosses disciplinary boundaries, and research that is undertaken in systematic programs that focus on these broad consequences and implications. We need that general recognition. And that is only possible if we are effective in articulating that need for the integrated approach, the multidisciplinary approach, in a way that works in the review systems and the evaluation systems that are still highly disciplinary based. It is challenging, and part of the message that we want to take forward is the message that the funding agencies have to from the beginning of the program, research programs that they are planning to fund, take this need into account. We certainly need research in this area that moves some of the unanticipated consequences to anticipated and provides us also with tools with which we can deal with them. The research would need to be research that very specifically is able to help policymakers to understand what the issues are that they should be dealing with and where the areas are where they have no need to be. Nobody is advocating for unnecessary regulation. At the same time, if policymakers have no idea of what this means and what the potential consequences are, it is very difficult to avoid an overreaction. One important question for researchers is, what is it that where we can genuinely make a difference that is unique? And one of the interesting perspectives that came up at the workshop was the recognition that when we look at the resources that the largest software providers and internet-based service providers put into this area, the Googles, Facebooks, Microsofts, Amazons of the world, and all the companies that are in those ecosystems, and the work that takes place within the national security apparatus in various parts of the world, it's tough to fight a fight against those resources and genuinely push the boundaries in ways that wouldn't be done by these companies. But we have a unique opportunity as an academic community to take the time and understand genuinely and in an unbiased way what the consequences are and guide the public discourse and be an active player there. And fundamentally, and finally, there is certainly, we can as a research community, one of the things that we can do very well is to support the building of the infrastructure that is required to do research based on big data and do it so that individual privacy is not violated. There are a variety of policy issues that we could talk about in this context. I'm going to leave that at this point and talk just a little bit about the research challenges and then wrap things up. The challenges in terms of research in this context are many, and particularly if we think about research that uses big data types of capabilities for research, we have challenges related to the individual identification and protection of privacy. Again, from the trust perspective, if trust is ever lost, it is very, very difficult to gain back. We also have the responsibility, I believe, as a research community, to be particularly careful about verification and validation and the understanding of the issues related to quality and the dangers of reuse. It's not worth doing our work in this space using big data if we don't take this seriously. Personally, I believe that this question of understanding causality, understanding justifications, understanding the role of theory in this context has to be highly visible in the conversation. If we don't do that, that's really important. And then finally, the question of access and accessing organizational contexts that are changing because of this. How do we get access to relevant contexts? Really interesting, challenging questions that we need to address. So, what are the key messages here? First of all, one is that big data has tremendous promise, and it these questions deserve our attention because of this significant promise. Because the promise can only be fulfilled in a context where the promise is not hype, but the promise is real. And for the promise to be real, it is only possible if it's done in an environment in which we are honest and accept the fact that not all is good, and that there are consequences, both intended and unintended, that are not only beneficial for all stakeholders. We are much more likely to be able to move forward with this in a way that is commonly accepted and that is beneficial genuinely for the largest possible number of stakeholders, if there is an ongoing discourse regarding the consequences, both negative and positive, if we do that guided by a structured approach, guided by a multidisciplinary foundation that is thoughtful and based on an open discourse. The issue of trust continues to be critically important. Again, if trust is lost, it can be lost either forever or for a very long time. And then finally, the message that we through this process want to take for a variety of decision makers regarding funding, this type of research that is required to understand the consequences will not happen if it isn't resourced adequately. So I want to acknowledge something very important. Many of these thoughts and ideas that I presented today are derived from the workshop that took place around these issues, from the magnificent participants that we had there, and a report that is coming out soon. There's a draft of that that my colleague Lynn Marcus has primarily written, and I absolutely, it's important that I acknowledge that contribution to these thoughts that I presented to you today. I really want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today and talk about these issues, and I hope we will now have time for a conversation. But also, if you have any thoughts and don't want to express them today, here's my email address, which I hope you will use, and I would love to hear from you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a very interesting and thought-provoking lecture. Any questions?
Please.
So I have a question which is concerned with ethics. The thing is that, to me, ethics is something which is inherently small scale. I mean, ethics, as I see it, is an instrument every person uses to give some colors to things which he or she sees in these immediate surroundings. The thing is that apparently ethics doesn't really, ethics doesn't really work as well as sleeky in the context of some large-scale things. Like, for instance, if we see person X acting aggressively towards person Y on the street, we know that this is bullying, and we all know that this is wrong. However, if we see the same thing at the level of states, there are always people who will find different explanations. And those explanations might seem ethical to different people which belong to different groups, but this fundamentally means that there is no way to actually have a universal canon which we could use to actually judge something ethical or not in the universal context. The thing with big data is that big data is inherently large scale. So to me, the problems you were talking about are very much, something which is very important in all these problems is that they appear on the contact surface of the large scale thing, big data, and this thing which looks small scale to me, ethics. So my question is, do you think that we need a completely different ethics to be able to actually integrate our own small worlds in the context of this big world, which becomes more and more united in the face of us, separated representatives of the human community? Or do you think that the present ethics which we have, it's not the ethics we have to pull to get connection with big scale things, or do we have to pull down big scale things to get in better connection with the current ethics we have?
Okay, so I was asked to repeat the question so that we get it for the benefit of those who might be reviewing this on tape. So let's see if I can do that in a way that does justice to your question. But essentially, the question was the question of how do we bring together in a competent way ethics, which often is in practice seen to be a small scale issue, in a sense that it's an individual making decisions all the time related to various real world context issues. And this, how do we deal with then in this context, if ethics is about small scale issues, how do we then apply that to very large scale phenomena such as big data that by definition is all-encompassing and potentially affects not only numerically large number of stakeholders, but very different stakeholders. So I think I don't think I have in any way an authoritative answer to this, but the way I would approach this is this. The only opportunity that we have to start to approach a situation where we as a community would take an ethically aware, at least, position regarding big data is that as many of the players as possible who make decisions that have an impact on these systems are aware of the ethical implications of their individual actions, and also hopefully not only are aware but also take them into account. And so, for example, let's just say that the role of these what I call the invisible technical workers, who ultimately make the specific decisions regarding algorithms that might be coding, for example, certain decisions regarding, say, decisions regarding loans in the mortgage industry, where there might be big ethical questions about biases that are built on those decisions, which in many ways could be seen as a kind of a big data question. So the only way we can, as a collective, start to approach these questions from an ethical perspective is that we build in systems, whether they are educational systems, whether they are systems of public discourse, whether they are public policy decisions and such, that make it crystal clear for as many of us as possible who work in this context that these individual decisions genuinely do matter from the collective perspective. So I agree with you that we collectively can't make these decisions. They are always individual decisions, either as those who do implement things or those who make large-scale decisions collectively, but there's always the individual decision maker. And we need to reach as many of these individual decision makers as possible and at least help them to be aware and hopefully give them tools to make decisions in an ethically healthy and aware way.
Okay, thank you very much.
We have another question here.
Yes?
Thank you very much for this most interesting talk. I really like that you also incorporated a sociological or human agency perspective in your talk. And I was wondering, you were moving through the topic of first degree of price discrimination, right?
Yes.
You mentioned it as a concern, right? But from a perspective from a company, an individual organization, it's quite reasonable to do so, right? To say, yeah, I want to offer individual prices to customers, and so I do want to discriminate price. basically the whole airline industry is looking at this way.
Mhm.
Yeah? So I was wondering, if you had access, like let's say you had access to these really decision makers designing the algorithms concerning price discrimination in the airline industry. It's quite an interesting field, right?
Mhm.
How would you design a study that really takes care of these unanticipated consequences you were talking about?
Okay, so the question was about the role of the first degree price discrimination, which when taken to the ultimate is essentially finding always the highest level of price that an individual is willing to pay for a specific type of service. And the airline industry is a great example of this, where it has already been taken quite far, not to the ultimate yet. And so the question is, how could we design, well, they certainly are pushing it, yes. How could we design a study in which, say, we could even evaluate the work of the individuals who are writing the algorithms, who are moving us further in this. Now, could you clarify still one thing? What would that study, what would your question be there regarding that study?
That's my question to you, basically. So what would be interesting from a perspective of the markers or this kind of research field you are pursuing?
So I believe the really interesting question is not necessarily the invisible technical workers' work regarding this, but it's a more systemic issue. And the systemic issue is this. I believe we can relatively easily show, not necessarily easily, but we can show that a first degree achieving a higher level of first degree price discrimination will essentially ultimately benefit not the consumer but the commercial entity, and that can be debated, and maybe I'm not probably competent to talk about that specific issue, that particular specific issue at a level that would help us forward here. But I think the question there, the fundamental question here in this context is exactly the question that if we are able to move in that direction and achieve that goal, who are the losers and who are the winners, and how can we gain a deep, as deep understanding as possible regarding the impacts of achieving that state, and how can we communicate those findings in a way that are understandable, for example, to the policymakers who are making decisions that create an environment where it is either possible to reach that ultimate state or not reach that. So let me not take a stand of what is beneficial and what is not, and who loses and who wins. But the question is, we would need research, whether it's by economists, whether it's by sociologists, whether it's by psychologists of decision making, whoever it is, that will lead to a deeper understanding of this particular consequence and its impact on various stakeholders. So I guess that's my position there, without taking a stand of who actually ultimately loses or wins. Yeah.
I have a simpler question here. So we talked about this possibly being a fourth scientific research paradigm. So what are the three previous ones, and which way would this be a new research paradigm?
So the idea there is, let me not address the first part because I'm not sure if I get it right. So I should, but I'm not. I don't want to mess up there. But the question of this being a new paradigm, that question I can address in a competent way right now. Let me get there. So the idea is that a claim can be made that increasingly often we get, using these approaches and methods, we get to a point where we have population level data. So we don't, if we follow that paradigm, the thinking would be that we don't anymore have to look at, for example, probability issues and confidence intervals and such. We don't have to form hypotheses and test them at a certain level confidence interval. The idea is that we're going to say, in this population and under this context, this is what it is. And so, and the paradigm being, we will, our goal will be to get to the population, and that we will explore whenever possible the population and look at that and make whatever claims we make by that type of observation. So purely population data driven approach to doing research. Now, there are serious questions about that, which I believe are really important to address, because when we do that, it often takes us away from the mechanisms and justifications. So when we do research that is based on statements of propositions and operationalizations of the propositions using hypotheses that are related to a specific context, and then doing data collection in whatever traditional form, and then doing hypothesis testing, that forces us to think about the reasons why something is true. So essentially, it forces us to think about theory. Theory in the form of statements regarding the relationships between various phenomena in that particular context, and changes in the case of statements regarding an impact of A to B, and or all systems of those. But still, there's always a question about justification. Why is this happening? It's a really, really poor theory if we don't understand what the mechanisms are. If we, however, take the approach and say, let's look at this at the population level, say the widely used example of Google being able to predict flu epidemics far earlier, much earlier than the US CDC was able to do for about, I think, 4 years, and then suddenly it didn't work the 5th year, and nobody had a clue why, because nobody ever knew why the first approach, for the first 4 years, it worked. And so losing this need to create well thought out, well justified causal mechanisms, if we lose that, that's a highly problematic issue. Yeah.
Certainly a lot of the data is not completely following, describing the whole population, but there are parts, some are lost there. It's a question of whether how truthful is the data that's there, and also whether it's biased. So then you're back to ordinary statistical issues, I guess. So is the fourth research paradigm in contrast to the statistical method? Is that what you are thinking that could be a new?
So that is, so let me repeat this just for the sake of again getting this on tape. So the question is, or your statement was that indeed we seldom have full population data, and that the data has biases, the data has errors, issues that have to be dealt with using statistical approaches. And the question was, is this idea of this fourth paradigm that we would be able to move forward from the need to use traditional statistical methods? And yes, that indeed is the thinking there. But I don't personally. I am very much, my thinking is aligned with the first part of your question, is that first of all, we couldn't truly, because of quality issues, because of issues, uncertainties related to the true nature of the data, that alone would be a reason not to believe that we can simply put aside traditional statistical approach. But in addition to that, I believe that is a major loss if we move away from the theory-driven world of knowing to a purely data-driven way of knowing. So I guess that's what I can say about that.
I've been working with these questions for quite a long time and started with MIS and TSS and BIS and all these systems, and now we are again with big data and also with statistics, and my experience is that decision makers are confused already by these earlier systems and they have difficulties to grasp it, but somehow these earlier methods, especially statistics, we have all these, that we have hypotheses and we have that this is true with that and that confidence, or yeah, and now we have this, what the big data brings to the decision maker. Do you think a decision maker will be confused on a higher level or less confused than with the earlier models?
Okay, so the question is a really interesting one about the level of confusion of decision makers, which there has been clear examples continuously of decision makers not being able to fully utilize the outcomes and outputs of various types of earlier approaches to producing data for decision making, such as systems that we have called with the names of MIS, DSS, Executive Information System, and so on. And particularly when we have dealt with questions related to statistical inference in those contexts. So the question was, now with big data, is this going to help with that confusion or make it even worse? I believe that because in practice right now, with the current methods and current technical approaches, we are still at the stage of this where the individual requirements for doing this work in a highly competent way are actually even more stringent than they were earlier. This is still as much of an art in practice as it is a science, however much we talk about data scientists, but still there's an element of unreplicability at times and such. So I think the level of confusion that this will introduce will highly depend on the quality of the intermediaries. So if the intermediaries who are the technical experts doing work in this area, if they are truly capable and are, in addition to their technical qualifications, are also good communicators and have the ability to translate the findings into the language of the decision maker, there's a potential, particularly combined with high quality data visualization tools, there's a potential that confusion is reduced. There's a potential. However, if there is a lack of capabilities at the expert level, and if experts are purely technical experts who are not able to communicate with language of the decision maker, and if experts are not able to understand what are truly relevant questions for the domain, the outcomes might be truly horrendous. And so I firmly believe that right now it's really a question about the qualifications of the intermediaries. And here I have to say that our programs in information systems and data analytics and business analytics and such have a tremendously important role in educating the people who will work in those roles.
Thank you very much for the And there are also other factors that are constraining the generation of data. For instance, for those promoting generation of data, you have things like social media being pervasive right now. We have data analytics companies like a promise that companies now see that they can get quite a lot of value by making use of data analytics, and that gives a push to collect data. You have e-commerce where e-commerce vendors are really trying to understand their customers, and that also pushes for more data. But on the other side of the matrix, you also find constraints like privacy, like you pointed out, especially in this Snowden era. People are more conscious about privacy. I don't want to give my data out. You also have things about ownership. Who really owns the data? Is it a company that's generating my data, or is it me as a subject of the data? And you have issues also like the utility of the data. How is this data about me being used? So these are kind of constraints to the generation of data. So the question now is, how do you see the interplay between these two factors in the evolution of data in the future?
Okay, so how do the multiple, or at least two, opposing forces related to generation and collection and storage of data, what impact do they have? On one hand, tremendous interest for a variety of reasons, many of them either commercial or government interests, to collect data and analyze it. And on the other hand, the concerns at the individual level and personal interest in not releasing one's data. Honestly, I don't think there's any question about this, that we are moving continuously and without any interruption towards an era where increasingly many phenomena are simply captured because it is possible. This happens in a number of contexts, and the only thing that could stop it in practice are very stringent legal requirements that would create constraints and boundaries, and with enforcement mechanisms that would be genuinely effective. I don't personally see that happening. And that's why this conversation is so fundamentally important, because if it's going to happen anyway, and because it is happening anyway, and many of these uses are incredibly useful and good, we should not do it blindly and should not allow it happen blindly, so that this conversation, this type of conversation, should take place, so that those decision makers who then are, whose organizations or whatever systems they are benefiting from the use of the very large collections of varieties of data that is coming at increasingly high speeds, that they would, in their decision processes, both regarding the analysis and the collection of the data, that they would understand at least what the risks are from the perspective of the individual stakeholders of the systems that are relevant for them, and that they might take self-governing actions against the things that might be potentially harmful for a very large number of people. I believe that this is a question about helping us create awareness at a level that leads to higher levels of enlightened decision making, or at least decision making that helps us avoid the biggest risks in this context. But it's not going to stop.
So I would like to thank you once again. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. It was really my pleasure. I appreciate it. Thank you.